to read a quick passage to tie in kind of the dramatic moments of the book here that we're all familiar with, but it never presented in such a beautiful way. So this is the interrogation of Christ, or subsequent to the interrogation of Christ by Pontius Pilate. Pilate was seething with anger, furious with the Jewish leaders. He had suggested the prisoners' release out of sensitivity to their situation to avoid embarrassing them by releasing Jesus outright. But now the Sanhedrin had humiliated him. The chief priests were ungrateful. They had prevailed over Pilate, and everyone knew it. Pilate would comply with their extortion. He would do what they demanded, but he would make them pay for it. He would humiliate them as they humiliated him. Now Pilate gestured toward Jesus, a gory caricature of royalty, and mocked the Jewish establishment. He said to the Jews, "Behold your king." They cried out, away with him, crucify him." Pilate's response was laden with sarcasm and contempt. "Shall I crucify your king?" But the reply of the chief priests and their minions is shocking. Perhaps they were so determined to put Jesus to death that nothing else mattered at the moment. Their response was utter blasphemy and overflowed with hypocrisy. The chief priests answered, "We have no king but Caesar." And I thought that was such an important background in terms of the motivations and the reaction, because you read the passage, you read the gospel accounts, and all you see is Pontius Pilate saying, "Behold the king."
Yeah.
And you don't see the context of, oh my gosh, he was just blackmailed. Perhaps you could talk a little bit about that.
About the blackmailing of Pilate?
Yeah, of course.
Sure. I mean, that's one of those little things that people don't really seem to understand. See, we have to remember that when the fuller story of what happened between Jesus and Pilate is captured by John the Evangelist. Of course, he appears in all. Pilate is presiding over the Roman trial in all four Gospels, but John gives us a bit more detail and explains to us what happened. So Pilate, and this is one of those things that the people who were alive when the Gospels were written would know these things. And remember that when the Gospels were written, those evangelists, they're not thinking, well, I'm going to write this down so 2,000 years later people will be talking about it. They're really writing for the immediate audience in the first century, and they know the background. It's we that don't know it. So that's one of the things I was hoping to provide for this book. So to answer your question about what happened with Pilate, he is depicted as reluctant to crucify Jesus. And this is one of the things that is most criticized in the Gospels by many Bible scholars and other people who don't really know better. They think that, well, because we know for a fact that Pilate was a pretty brutal guy. Okay, there's no question about that. So when the Gospels depict Pilate as reluctant to crucify Jesus, people are assuming that, well, the gospel writers are sort of softening the portrayal of Pilate. They want to make the Jews to be the bad guys. They want the responsibility for the death of Jesus to be on the Jews, so that the Roman Empire would treat them better. Well, that's ridiculous, because the Roman Empire was not persecuting Christians because they blamed Jesus' death on Pilate. Okay, as a matter of fact, Romans would be very uncomfortable with the portrayal of Pilate. They wouldn't like Pilate being reluctant. Okay, we have to realize that the assumptions that we make when we interpret the story are based on the way we think today. We have to understand that people understood things and had different basic presumptions about law and justice and gods and that sort of a thing back then. So Pilate really was reluctant to crucify Jesus. And that is in spite of the fact that he was very tough on crime and insurrection, as all governors were. The reason is because Jesus really was not being charged with a crime. So he, as an official of the Roman state, one of the main responsibilities of a governor was to hear court cases. He was very experienced in this. That was one of their main duties. He could only try a person who was accused of a crime under Jewish law. under Roman law, not Jewish law. So when the Jewish leaders take Jesus before him, he says, well, what has he done? And they say, if he wasn't an evildoer, we would not have brought him to you. Well, evildoer is not a crime. So Pilate's immediate reaction is take him away and judge him according to your own law, which they had the right to do. And they did have their own courts and they had their own laws. They just couldn't put anyone to death legally, well, except in a very limited circumstance. So then they realized it's amazing that they really thought that all they had to do is bring Jesus to Pilate and he would rubber stamp it. But he can't do that. He's not supposed to do that. And he doesn't want to be bothered with getting involved in what he recognizes is a religious dispute. He knows these people. Pilate was governor of Judea for 12 years. He knows the players. He knows their interests. He knows their little, quirks. So he knew that Jesus immediately, from what they said, had not committed a crime. So then they come up with this idea of treason, that Jesus made himself out to be a king. Well, if Jesus really was guilty of treason, then Pilate wouldn't have any hesitation to put him to death. But Pilate knows that that's not true for a number of reasons, including the fact that that's not the charge that they brought Jesus to him with. And so he doesn't want to get involved. And there's another reason why Pilate is reluctant. Jesus isn't like anyone else who had ever been brought before Pilate, especially someone with being threatened with crucifixion. Jesus is calm. Jesus is speaking. He's very calmly. He's having a dialogue. He's not begging for his life. He's not trying to defend himself. He's not offering Pilate a bribe. He's doing nothing like what an ordinary prisoner would do. And Pilate has never heard of Jesus before. So he knows that he hasn't been fomenting rebellion because these people had a lot of informants and they would have known. Pilate would have known if Jesus was a threat. So Pilate is reluctant to crucify Jesus. I mean, this idea that just because he was tough on crime means that he would be willing to crucify an innocent person is kind of silly. All right. There's no basis for that. And there's something else. Jesus starts speaking of himself and his kingdom is not of this world. And Pilate recognizes that Jesus is speaking very kind of metaphorically, spiritually. And he kind of thinks that, maybe Jesus is a philosopher kind of a thing. He's not quite sure. But Jesus is not acting like anyone else. And so, but he's convinced that Jesus hasn't committed a crime. So when he expresses his reluctance to execute Jesus and says he hasn't committed a crime, the Jewish leaders say he deserves to die because he made himself the Son of God. And now Pilate gets really nervous because the Romans had this idea that gods came to earth and appeared as human beings. That was very much part of their culture. They assumed that that was true. That was part of Greek mythology and Roman mythology. So now Pilate becomes very afraid. And so he says to Jesus, "Where are you from?" And Jesus doesn't answer. And Pilate now he's a little bit offended because he's the governor. And he says, you have the power? I mean, I have the power to crucify you. Don't you realize that? You won't speak to me, but I have the power to crucify you. And then Jesus says something so unnerving when he says, you don't have any power except if it was given to you from above. Now, Pilate really wants nothing to do with this case. He's already realized that Jesus hasn't committed a crime under Roman law. He really doesn't want to be involved. So how is it that the Jewish leaders convince Pilate to execute Jesus? Because Pilate is afraid of divine retribution, that the gods will punish him terribly if he kills one of the gods or does this to a god. Well, the Jewish leaders know that there was a very well-known Roman, his name is Lucius Sejanus, and he was an equestrian, and he was somebody that Pilate would have known. Pilate was of the equestrian rank, and he was a top advisor to Tiberius Caesar. And he was called friend of Caesar, and because he was a top advisor to Tiberius. But recently, maybe a few months prior to this, he had been executed by Tiberius Caesar on a charge of treason. Tiberius Caesar was very paranoid. he was all Caesars were, because they knew that there were lots of people who wanted them dead so they could take the throne. So Tiberius Caesar, whether rightly or wrongly, had put Sejanus to death. And the Jewish leaders know this. They're very political. So when they said to Pilate, if you don't put this man to death, you are no friend of Caesar, he realizes immediately that what happened to Sejanus could easily happen to him, and that if he does not execute Jesus, the Jewish leaders, will report to Tiberius that they had brought a person accused of treason to Pilate, and Pilate refused to execute him. And Pilate himself would be put to death. So Pilate now is forced to put Jesus to death. And he's really angry because when you started out by talking about that they were ungrateful, that he had tried to help them, that part wasn't explained. With the Barabbas incident, Pilate also recognizes that they have brought Jesus to Pilate to be put to death. And if Pilate just releases Jesus, that's an embarrassment to them. Okay. And he's trying to find a way for them to save face. So Pilate comes up with the Barabbas option. How about if I release him? And they say, not him, but Barabbas. So he is trying to find a way for the Jewish leaders to say, well, Jesus was really guilty, but Pilate released him out of clemency. You see what I'm saying? Yeah. But instead, they don't want Jesus released. They want Barabbas released. They make sure that happens. And so Pilate doesn't want to release Barabbas. Barabbas really is a murderer. He really is an insurrectionist. So he sets it up so that they could save face, but instead they ensure that Pilate releases a real murderer, a real insurrectionist, and Pilate is forced to crucify Jesus and does something he didn't want to do. So there is a lot of drama there. It's kind of a long answer.
Yeah, no, but thank you. This is perfect, and you could see the transition from this kind of conversational Pilate now to somebody who's just insulting the
and
Jews.
So he says what now he knows that he has to execute Jesus, and so he says, "Behold your king." And they just hate that. And also with the titulus, don't say this is the king of the Jews. Say this man said he was the king of the Jews. And Pilate says, no, it's going to say this is the king of the Jews. He's your king. And there's tremendous irony in that because he's right. Jesus is their king because Jesus is God. Yeah. So, there's a lot of ways you could say, behold the man, or behold your king. And I think he really said it with a lot of sarcasm. John doesn't describe it that way, but I think that that's what was going on. And he would have said, here's your king. Yeah. We have no king but Caesar. And it's a shocking statement. We have no king but Caesar. Wow.
Yeah. And that's what I was getting at is that this is open blasphemy in the middle of a blasphemy trial. Right?
Yeah, it's true.
And so maybe we could talk about the motivation. You could talk about the motivation of the high priest, because we always think that the high priests and Rome, they're enemies with each other, and there's so much tension there. Yes. But the way you bring it up is actually they were kind of helping each other out, and this was there was an unspoken arrangement, so to speak.
That's right. And not only with the Jewish leadership, but in every kingdom and tribe and little nation that the Romans had conquered. This was their arrangement. First of all, to understand the crucifixion, we have to understand the Roman culture. And it's a culture built on class distinctions and the aristocracy making sure that it remains in power. And that means that they have to subjugate the lower classes. So this was the case not only in Judea, but everywhere. So we assume that the Jews hated the Romans. And I don't think that the Jewish leaders, the high priests, were happy to be occupied by the Romans. I have no doubt about that. They weren't happy about it. But definitely it was Rome that kept the Jewish aristocracy, the chief priests and the high priests in power. It is Rome that chose the high priest. It had long since ceased being a hereditary position. Instead, this was now a position that was the high priesthood, the priests were chosen by the Roman governor. And that's pretty shocking. But who are they going to choose? Are they going to choose the most pious person? No, they're going to choose the person who cooperates with them and pays them the biggest bribe. So the whole system was entirely corrupt by this point. And this is how the Romans maintained power, by enlisting the help of the local aristocracy in many different regions, not just in Judea. And as long as they maintained control over the populace, they were allowed to pretty much do as they pleased, as long as they respected Rome, paid Roman taxes, and kept order. So there was a strong incentive on the part of the aristocracy, of the high priest and the chief priest, there were Jewish aristocrats, wealthy Jews who were not connected directly to the temple. They weren't priests, but most of the aristocrats in Judea were the chief priests and the high priest. They had the power, but they worked in very close cooperation with Rome. And I think this is one reason why the chief priests, when they brought Jesus to Pontius Pilate, they just figured he would rubber stamp the execution, and they weren't prepared. It's pretty shocking. They bring Jesus to Pilate and they don't state a crime. They're really unprepared to prosecute the case. And this is something else that I explain in the book. They're supposed to prosecute the case. They didn't have professional prosecutors back then. If somebody was accusing another person of an offense, the person who's making the accusation has to prosecute the case, and they're completely unprepared. And Pilate doesn't want to be bothered with their little religious disputes. It's not his job, and it's not something that he's willing to venture into.